General Hospital spoilers tease that a horrifying shock has been officially confirmed to occur on the night of the 2025 Nurses' Ball, shaking not only the glamorous stage of Port Charles's most iconic annual event, but also appending the lives of those who once believed the evening would be nothing more than a celebration of compassion and artistry. The Nurses' Ball. Traditionally a symbol of unity, where doctors, nurses, and townspeople joined together in heartfelt performances to raise money for charity, was this year disrupted by the sudden and chilling appearance of a mysterious man. He had no name, no introduction, and no one in the audience had ever seen him before. He didn't enter through the front door, wasn't on the guest list, and bypassed every layer of security. It was precisely this haunting stealth that made his presence so disturbing. He didn't utter a word, just one cold glance sweeping across the crowd was enough to drain the air from the room. The music from the previous act still lingered unfinished, the stage lights remained bright, but every mind in the ballroom was consumed by the eerie presence. What made the shock even more horrifying was how instantly he disrupted the emotional and psychological balance of everyone there. Drew, often regarded as a beacon of resilience and optimism, instantly transformed into a man gripped by panic, as if all the secrets he tried to bury were now towering before him. Willow froze, her eyes filled with confusion and doubt. Carly, the ever-proud woman who always kept control, suddenly looked lost, as though watching everything she had built crumble before her eyes. And Michael, long thought to be recovering somewhere in Europe, appeared to be the unstoppable force behind this reckoning, the embodiment of a truth that could no longer stay buried. When the mysterious man stepped into the center of the ballroom, a terrifying silence fell over the crowd. Performers halted, music cut off mid-note, and applause died in the air like it had been strangled. His gaze didn't stop at one person. It swept over every face as if silently declaring, "I know everything." And at that very moment, Jason's phone rang. A mysterious call that he glanced at once before vanishing backstage without a word. Mere seconds later, Sonny stood up from his table, leaving without explanation, as if driven by a gut feeling that something unstoppable had arrived. And then came the whispers, "Who is this man? Where did he come from? Why is his presence making the most powerful men in town visibly tense?" In less than 10 minutes, the Nurses' Ball, once a sanctuary of safety, healing, and hope, had become the epicenter of collapse. Long-buried secrets began to surface. Relationships built on lies began to crack. And most notably, no one dared stop the man, perhaps because, deep down, they all knew, something was wrong, and the bearer of the truth had finally come to make them face it. This shock wasn't just a sudden twist, it was the culmination of years of suppression, the final sign that the age of hiding was over. A new explosion had begun. Every secret, every manipulation, every lie would now be exposed, not through whispers, but through living proof, through the eyes of the man who emerged from the shadows carrying the full truth that Port Charles had feared for so long. And under the still glowing stage lights, no one knew what would happen next, only that none of them would emerge from this night unscathed. The Nurses' Ball had been permanently altered, and Port Charles was now on the brink of an inevitable quake. A new madness is silently, yet violently, erupting in Port Charles. Not only has Michael unexpectedly returned after a long period of assumed treatment in Germany, but Morgan, Sonny's son, long presumed dead, has also suddenly reappeared, alive and present in a town still haunted by the pain of his loss. Each man brings with him a distinct past, a chain of buried trauma, and a survival story that once seemed impossible. Now, they return together, at the most chaotic moment of Nurses' Ball 2025, triggering a seismic event no one in Port Charles can resist or ignore. No longer rumor, no longer desperate hope, the return of Michael and Morgan is a raw, undeniable truth, setting off a chain reaction never seen before in the town's history. One of the first major shifts began the moment Michael stepped out from backstage, his eyes scanning the crowd without hiding the fury brewing inside him. Willow went speechless. Drew looked dazed, like a man suddenly cut loose from reality. And Carly, the woman who thought she had orchestrated everything flawlessly, was frozen, unable to utter a word as she faced the son she once protected by handling his legal affairs, signing his divorce papers, and petitioning for custody of his children. But if Michael's return alone was enough to paralyze the entire ballroom, then Morgan's appearance moments later. Just after the music fell silent and people hadn't yet gathered their wits, felt like a direct emotional blow. Morgan, the boy mourned by the whole town, the son whose family had struggled through endless grief, now stepped into the spotlight as a living witness to a buried conspiracy, to truths no one had dared to imagine might one day resurface. He didn't speak at first. He just looked. Eyes filled with pain, doubt, and the sorrow of someone once cast aside by life, presumed dead, forgotten. Then he turned to Sonny, the father who had carried the guilt of his death, and in that moment, no one could tell what was real anymore, truth, grief, guilt, or shattered dreams. Everything blurred into a spiraling vortex. Murmurs rose, then stopped. Curious glances turned to fear. The nurses' ball was no longer a tribute to compassion and art. It had become a battlefield with the ghosts of the past. Michael and Morgan's return was not just personal, not merely a reunion of lost sons. It was an uprising of a new generation, survivors of abandonment, deceit, and manipulation, now determined to reclaim what was taken from them, at any cost. Those who once thought they had control, Carly, Drew, even Sonny, were now forced to admit they had miscalculated everything. Michael brought proof of being denied access to his family, of the lies in the Baden-Baden clinic, of Drew bribing medical staff to hide Willow's presence. Morgan, quieter but just as fierce, carried fragments of his captivity, clues to the mastermind behind his fake death, and the shattered memories now forming into a tale darker than anything Port Charles had ever seen. The unease spread like wildfire. Willow, broken, began to question everything she once believed. She saw she was not just a victim, but a pawn. Drew, once a symbol of reason, now cornered by accusations he could no longer deny. Carly, the mother who always acted for her children, was stripped of her moral facade, now confronted by both sons, demanding the right to choose, to speak, to live. No one knows what comes next. But one thing is certain, Nurses Ball 2025 is no longer a charity gala. It is the catalyst for a permanent shift in Port Charles's power structure. Michael and Morgan, once thought lost forever, have returned as two flames, one burning silently and fiercely, the other cold and cutting, both ready to destroy every illusion and reveal the naked truth. There is nothing left to hide. No one is safe. And this small town will never be the same again. The explosion has begun, and not even those who tried to bury the truth can stop the fire now. The meeting between Michael and Sasha took place in secret, far from the dazzling lights of the 2025 Nurses Ball, a bitter contrast between what is publicly displayed and what is quietly shaping the future of Port Charles. No one knew exactly how Michael had reached out to Sasha, nor where they met, perhaps in an abandoned hospital corridor, a secluded backstage corner where performers slipped away to change costumes, or a quiet room on a high floor only accessible to insiders. But whatever the location, that conversation sparked a new chain of events, laying the groundwork for a simmering but dangerous resistance slowly spreading through the town. Michael, presumed to be recovering in Germany, in truth knew far too much about what had transpired in his absence, shady legal maneuvers, forged decisions, and agreements orchestrated by Carly and Drew, all in the name of family interests. He couldn't stay silent. He couldn't accept being cut out of his son's life, from Willow's heart, from the entire machine he once helped run. And so he turned to Sasha, someone who, like him, had been broken, publicly shamed, silently stripped of everything. What remained between them was no longer love, but something deeper, the bond of survivors of a storm of deception. Their conversation didn't begin with pleasantries. Michael dove straight into the heart of it, no pretenses, no delay. Because time had run out for half-truths. He needed to know exactly what Sasha had seen in his absence. He needed to hear from her every detail, closed-door meetings, legal documents drafted in back offices, hushed hospital conversations between Carly and board members, and how Drew managed the guardianship of Wiley and Amelia as if Michael had ceased to exist. Sasha, after a moment of hesitation, began to talk. Not out of vengeance, but because she knew. If anyone deserved the truth, it was Michael. Every detail she shared left him more stunned, more furious, more resolved. What he had suspected wasn't just a feeling, it was a reality deliberately hidden. Carly hadn't just made marital decisions on his behalf. She had lobbied for temporary custody of his children, signed treatment consents as though she were him, and even told the court that Michael was legally incompetent at the time. Drew had quietly backed her, working with attorneys and meeting with Willow to steer her toward what's best for the kids. The entire system had fallen under their quiet, coordinated control, unchallenged, unquestioned. In that moment, something ignited in Michael's chest, not pain, but clarity. He realized that if he wanted to reclaim his rights as a father, as a man with agency over his own life, he couldn't count on goodwill or wait for others to change. He had to fight. And the meeting with Sasha was the beginning of a carefully crafted counteroffensive. Sasha, now a living witness, was the only person who could confirm what had been done behind his back. She had attended the hospital meetings, heard Carly's conversations with doctors, seen Drew slipping in and out of law offices in the dead of night. The fragments she held were the first bullets in the battle Michael was preparing to launch. A transformation had begun to take shape in Michael's mind. A radical shift in how he approached everything. Once, he had believed in forgiveness, in family, in protecting loved ones through silence. But that silence had only written him out of his own story. He understood now, Carly wasn't evil, but she had overstepped, believing she knew best for everyone. Drew justified manipulation with reason. And Willow, the woman he once loved more than anything, had been the first to believe the lie that Michael had abandoned her. Everything he once held dear now lay in someone else's hands, and he had no choice but to take it all back, piece by piece. The meeting ended in silence, but Sasha's quiet nod as she left the room was a wordless promise. She would stand with the truth. She was no longer the trembling woman shattered by loss, no longer the shadow of her former self after that scandal. She was now a witness, a keeper of fire. And Michael, back from the edge, was the one who would turn her truth into strategy, into action, into full-scale upheaval. Meanwhile, outside, the nurses' ball carried on, lights, music, polite smiles and political handshakes, but within, at the very heart of Port Charles, the first steps of a silent rebellion had just begun. Michael was no longer the victim of a power play. He was a player now, and this time, he would not lose. As for Morgan's story, a darker, more dangerous layer was beginning to unfold in Port Charles, one no one could have predicted. His return was not simply a personal revelation or a family milestone. It was a declaration of war. Morgan hadn't come back just to reclaim himself after years of being declared dead by the world. He came bearing quiet recalibrations aimed straight at Ava, the woman who once held sway over his life and helped cast him into years of darkness and erasure. Morgan's return wasn't about revenge. It was about reckoning. Ava, a symbol of manipulation, betrayal, and ruthless charm, was his first target. The woman he had once loved, once idolized, had also been the architect of his destruction. Now, Morgan had returned with a piercing gaze and clarity sharpened by years of silence. He remembered everything Ava never thought he would. The lies whispered in his ear, the warm embraces hiding ulterior motives, the seductive smiles that lured him deeper into chaos. Ava hadn't saved him, she had exploited him, using his instability to manipulate others and expand her own power. While Morgan was being stripped of identity and pronounced dead, Ava continued building her image, weaponizing his memory as a shield. But Morgan was no longer a ghost. He had returned to reorder the chessboard. And Ava would be the first piece to fall. The plot thickened when Christina, torn between family loyalty and personal direction, secretly allied herself with Morgan. Both had their own reasons for wanting Ava gone from Port Charles. Christina had watched Ava's influence infect Sonny, damage her mother's life, fracture the Corinthos family. To her, Ava was the silent cancer corroding everything. But it was the Morgan-Christina alliance that made the plan truly dangerous. Morgan didn't act like a man seeking vengeance. He acted like a strategist, calm, precise, chilling. The madness in their plot didn't lie in its ferocity, but in its elegance. They didn't confront Ava head-on, nor expose her publicly. They began by isolating her, creating cracks in her political, financial, and personal alliances. Christina became the observer, whispering rumors within the town council about shady dealings. Morgan reached out to Ava's past. Julian, Trina, Nicholas, former investors, leaving just enough doubt, just enough suspicion, just enough truth to sow chaos. But Ava's true unraveling wasn't from loss of power, it was from the haunting sense of being hunted by a past she thought buried. Morgan's returning memory became her undoing. He reminded her of that final night before the car explosion, of what seemed like an innocent conversation that was, in fact, a calculated manipulation. He recalled the switched medications, the tampered treatments, the whispers that pushed him toward the edge of reality. Each recollection chipped away at Ava's control. She, once the master of every situation, was now unraveling. The dread wasn't just that the truth might emerge, it was that Morgan, whom she believed buried in lies, had returned not as a broken man, but as a psychological storm ready to wash away all pretense. The final blow came when Morgan began working with forces Ava once thought she owned. He contacted the journalist she had silenced, the business partners she betrayed, even forged ties with old enemies, building a network from which Ava could not escape. Every move was calculated, every step closing in. The clearest sign of Ava's downfall came as her most loyal allies turned away. Trina, once her protégée, began to distance herself. Sunny, who once protected Ava for deeply personal reasons, could no longer ignore the mounting whispers. Even Carly, her former nemesis, grew cautious of her presence. Ava had no safe harbor left. And in the final moment, looking into Morgan's eyes, she knew, nothing could save her now. Because the real shock wasn't the revenge. It was the realization that Morgan, who had once loved her, trusted her, been destroyed by her, now understood everything. And he was ready to rewrite the ending. Not with a gun. Not with blood. But with memory, silence, and every quiet step that would push Ava into the abyss she had dug with her own hands. Michael and Morgan may not be in Port Charles for long, and that possibility is creating a new shockwave, a chain of events that has every force in town on high alert. The unexpected return of the Corinthos sons at the 2025 Nurses' Ball has upended a political, emotional, and personal order that has been held together by a thin veneer of morality. But now, in just a few short days, the possibility that they will leave early has made everything more fragile than ever. It's no longer a question of who's right and who's wrong, but the fact that if Michael and Morgan disappear again, they'll leave a void no one can fill, and chaos no one can control. The chaos begins the moment everyone realizes that neither of them may be back for long. Michael seemed to have returned only to clear up the wrongs that had been done to him, from the Baden-Baden incident, to the custody of the children, to the divorce from Willow that he had not signed or agreed to. He came like a sharp, cold wind, tearing down every shield of lies built by Carly and Drew, then quietly prepared to leave, taking the children with him or leaving behind lingering legal consequences that he was no longer directly responsible for. Morgan, on the other hand, returned as a storm of emotions, full of anger, grief, and determination. But in his eyes, one thing was clear, he did not belong here anymore. He no longer saw Port Charles as a home, but as the final battlefield he had to enter to clean up the ruins of the lost years. If they both left, what they would leave behind would be more than unfinished conversations. There will be deep cuts to trust, legal cases that have yet to be closed, relationships that have been pushed to the limit and no one is competent to resolve them. Willow will be left in limbo, between Michael, whom she once loved and who is slowly coming to understand the truth, and Drew, who once represented stability but has now lost faith. Carly will be left isolated, with Michael no longer there to protect her, with Morgan turning her back without giving her a chance to make amends. Sunny will be caught between guilt and redemption, realizing that both sons no longer belong to the world he tried to preserve. The real shock is not their actions, but their long-term consequences. One of the biggest complications is that the hidden power structure in town, from the hospital board to the donors, from the lawyers to the media, that was kept stable by Michael's presence as a rational intermediary, suddenly loses a key element. And Morgan, with his memories of conspiracies, of Ava, of manipulation, could carry information that would shatter many people if it were released elsewhere, where the media isn't as tightly controlled as Port Charles. His ability to leave without warning could create a time bomb. No one knows when it will explode, and no one knows what he holds. Port Charles has never seen such turmoil. People thought dead are alive. People who were silent are speaking out. And as they prepare to leave, the town is left to fear not their absence, but what will happen next. Michael and Morgan may be gone from sight, but what they have stirred up will remain long after they are gone, a never-ending rift in the seemingly solid foundation of Port Charles.